There once existed true heroes of the People's Imperium. Yes, such an empire existed, fleeting as it was. An age ago now, champions sold their lives in conflicts which saw millions of combatants clash in desperate wars for territory, resources, or power. Gene-crafted horrors once of human stock were unleashed and set against steel-armored techno-barbarians. In fact, these disputes between disparate warlords would define this dystopian era. That is, until something far more deadly began its own, altogether more disciplined, idealistic campaign. What you must understand before our tale proceeds is that we speak now of a different age. The events of this time are defined by epic deeds as much as they are by the commonplace brutality and hardships experienced by mundane humans in their struggle to see just one more dawn. Often referred to as the time of anarchy, even by dauntless warriors such as Captain General Konstantin Valdor, these millennia saw atomic destruction enough to level civilizations. Technology forged at the height of humanity's scientific understanding, employed against its own in displays of callous hatred. We will start at the beginning, which is actually the end, a statement which will make sense before this vidlog runs to zero. Okay, just quickly, be aware we make content about the newest lore as it's released, and also the more interesting, less discussed topics. It helps us greatly if you like and share, so YouTube shares our lore with more of the 40k community. Subscribe and hit the notification icon if you'd enjoy having the newest lore delivered to you soon after it's published. Thanks for your support, guys. The final chapter in the Thunder Warriors' glorious, if not infamous tale is one which may have even opened the way for the corrupting influence of the Chaos Pantheon to pervade the young Imperium's reason and logic and replace it with its own hate-fueled zeal. These champions surpass the abilities of even Space Marines, bridging that practically immeasurable divide between Astartes and Custodian. You see, the Thunder Warrior legions were in fact resistant to the malign influence of warp-fueled sorcery, unlike the Adeptus Astartes, who would replace the Legiones Custages as mankind's premier defenders, but they were all of them betrayed. You see, following centuries of campaigning across the entire surface of Terra, these gene-enhanced warriors were put down by their own master. What should have been these legions' crowning moment of glory instead was a bleak, brutal affair, one that many of virtue could not possibly countenance even over a century later. There is no record, official or otherwise, which depicts the final moment of these champions of mankind. There is no retelling of how each peerless warrior felt as the dawn of realization illuminated their minds, turning a moment of celebration into one of hate and perhaps even sadness. They were butchered almost to a man in an underhanded ploy which took the form of one last great battle, a battle to conclude all their efforts, all the sacrifices in the name of Terra's unification. Upon the peak of Mount Ararat, this fated execution would ensue. Even decades after the premeditated event, the area had been scoured clean of the dead of both sides. Many traces of armor and equipment betrayed the identity of those who participated in battle that day. But before we discuss the more, one could say, esoteric facts surrounding the Thunder Warriors, we must explore the warriors themselves in detail, the might they were crafted to bear in order to conquer Terra, as well as their often flamboyant war gear and even attitudes. The fact we mentioned earlier, that these warriors' capabilities could be firmly gauged between Astartes and one of the Emperor's golden custodians, is a true enough statement. There was a byproduct of the Imperium's, at the time, less advanced gene crafting capabilities. The Thunder Warriors maintained a significant portion of their own self-will, even personality. So whilst individually, a member of the Custages may have bore strength and especially reflexes far surpassing that of any Space Marine, they were perhaps most fortunate enough to bear their own sense of self, whereas Custodians and Space Marines surely did not, even 10,000 years in the future. In this way, a Thunder Warrior could feel the rush of combat more keenly than any World Eater. They took pride in the skills they honed, wielding both blade and projectile weapon. This sense of gratification and accomplishment felt far more deeply than any of Fulgrim's sons, though ultimately their loyalty was rooted in duty and honour, more so than it was a designated attribute of their gene crafting, a trait it seems the Lion's sons were created to almost guarantee. In the millennia which succeeded Terra's planet-wide conquest, the Emperor's angels, that is, his Astartes, are considered by humanity's trillions to be angels dispatched from the God Emperor himself in order to punish those heretics and Xenos who would murder his flock or defile his holy realm. This was never the case for his Thunder Warriors. The conquest of Terra, that is the Great War for Unity, would see the Emperor, merely considered a powerful warlord at the time, utilizing his Thunder Warriors to scour the taint of sorcery and genetic deviation which had become so deeply rooted within Terra's gene lines. This time of logic as well as scientific revolution would ensure that when the Legiones Castagus freed and oppressed peoples, rather than being worshipped by zealous masses, they were instead adored, considered more celebrities than angels. As a means of thanking and supporting those who had freed tormented civilizations from the raids of cannibal tribes or barbaric sorceress overlords, adults would send their tithes to the Legio, wrapped in messages of thanks or adoration. Children freed from the oppressive weight of forced labour or starvation would take to the street to play games, simulating their heroes, adorning themselves in makeshift pretend plate, waving sticks to imitate a Thunder Warrior's blade. They would pretend to slay evil witches or mutated beasts. Divided into 20 formations which were organised along standard regimental structure, these legions were a precursor to the Astartes legions. Denoted by a numeral between 1 and 20, each legion bore a specialization. For example, the 4th Legiones Castagus, known as the Iron Lords, were especially skilled as well as equipped for siegecraft. The comparability in legio number designation, name, and even specialization is an obvious match to the 4th Legiones Astartes Iron Warriors, also masters of siegecraft. Rather than being commanded by a general, colonel, captain, or lieutenant, the rank responsible for each Thunder Warrior Legion was called Primarch, with of course 20 Primarchs in total when all appointments had been filled. Do not make the mistake, however, of relating these commanders to the Emperor's demigod sons in any way other than title, as the Thunder Warriors Legion's commanders were not designed any differently than their men. These paragons of martial capability bore no preordained affinity with their craft or superhuman abilities such as the Emperor's own Primarch sons were known to. No, the original mortal Primarchs each earned that coveted rank, distinguishing themselves in battle and as a leader of men, perhaps exhibiting how singular and important the Thunder Warriors once were. Each Primarch was appointed directly by the Emperor himself. As the Emperor's forces uncovered new technologies, simultaneously conquering territories which would bring the Emperor's burgeoning empire either important resources or ancient technologies, the various regiments which fought under his banner, at that time being the Imperialis Raptoris, benefited from better manufactured equipment, including, of course, weapons and armour. It has been stated by none other than Valdor himself that the Thunder Warriors, being at the forefront of the Emperor's conquering armies, bore equipment comparable even to the Custodes of that era. Do not make the mistake of hearing this passage and assume this refers to Auramite armour or Custodian spear, mind you, for equipment of that quality was not implemented until quite late in Terra's unification. As more territory was claimed by the Emperor's conquest, so too was ancient technology from humanity's past recovered, and so were his army's equipment gradually improved. The Custodians were not always golden. A Thunder Warrior's armour was often bronze, no doubt the thunderbolt symbol of their order adorned on either pauldron, breastplate, or vambrace. A cloak of crimson could be pinned to their plate, with plumes of matching colour adorning their helms. From the earliest stages of Terra's conquering, Thunder Warriors were armed with rifles capable of firing either solid projectiles or lass rifles, with early patterns of bolt guns surpassing these, though again, This progression towards what we now recognize as standard imperial equipment would not occur until the latter stages of unification, and therefore not long prior to the betrayal on Mount Ararat. Understand that where Astartes are scalpels, finely honed to achieve particular objectives in unison with their brothers, Thunder Warriors were akin to a sledgehammer, many times more powerful, though a blunt, trauma-inducing force, which at times was equally ponderous to wield. Early in the years of that bloody conquest now referred to as the Unification Wars, the Thunder Warriors were fielded in small bands, definitely never legion-sized. But as the Emperor's foundling imperium began to challenge greater foes, and therefore larger kingdoms, ones which could field a similar quality of soldiery, it became necessary to field the Legiones Contagious en masse. The very first of these deployments was the well-documented campaign against the foul Priest King and his unified peoples located in what was once referred to as Scandinavia, and known collectively as the Molnar-Sen Confederacy. The honour of deploying as a united legion for the very first time in the Imperium's history fell to the 4th, the Iron Lords, under command of Primarch Ushitan. Notably, this was also the first time the legions had been deployed alongside standard mortal troopers, 22 regiments of cold weather specialists in the case of Molnar-Sen. One of the most notable findings regarding the Thunder Warriors is that their performance deployed as a united legion was the one and only reason the Emperor's forces were victorious, even though the Emperor himself was present. Now this is quite interesting, because not only were these gene-enhanced warriors powerful in combat, proving the match for the hordes of corrupted, sewn-together monstrosities faced during those battles, but something not often discussed is that they even proved somewhat uncorruptible, or at least not tempted by the warp-born sorcery utilized by the Priest King's minions. At least they weren't affected in the way we often see corruption take hold in contemporary 40k, where even veteran mortal soldiers lost their minds facing the reanimated spectral forms of their dead colleagues, or the incessant maddening whispers carried by those icy Nordic winds. The Thunder Warriors stood resolute before unleashing their full wrath in what can only be described as an orgy of horrific, wanton butchery. Following their numerous clashes with what was some of the earliest chaos-influenced techno-barbarians, rather than succumb to chaos-maddening influence, the legions seemed to repel this energy back towards its source, with the violence magnified many times over. Do you, listener, believe this to be a reaction superior to Astartes' conditioning, or is the wanton violence unleashed by the Thunder Warriors in reply to chaos corruption a characteristic which makes them substandard to the Legiones Astartes of the Great Crusade era? Let us know in the comments what you think. Whilst in the joyous, even illuminating grip of these violence-fueled rampages, the Thunder Warriors had almost no care for the nature of those who fell to their blade. To again utilize the well-documented actions during the Molnar-Sen campaign, it was Primarch Ushitan of the 4th Legion who penetrated the outer defences of the Priest King's final bastion of defence. Once this outer shell was cracked, his legion fell upon all inside in what was a thorough, absolute slaughter of all those who resided within. Their wrath was not simply reserved to the Priest King's fighting men. Slaves, women, children, it mattered not. The butchery was complete as it was indiscriminate. Given the immense scale of this most recent campaign, the Thunder Warriors themselves believed they'd found their true Emperor-gifted purpose, and so then on were more prone to conducting bloody, unnecessary purges on those they were unleashed against. At times, the Legiones Contagious were so audacious in this butchery that their own casualties were shockingly high. For example, once Molnar-Sen's main citadel fell, the Thunder Warriors' casualties numbered over 7,000 gene-enhanced warriors. Be they toppling heavily fortified holdings of a particular barbaric warlord, or allegedly liberating the oppressed, it was not uncommon for crowds of innocents to run screaming, coated in the blood of their own people, away from the Emperor's unleashed avatars of murder. should the masses of adoring citizenry belonging to this newly founded Imperium have witnessed the savage reality of the Thunder Warrior at war, it is doubtful many would have been so fervent in their adoration of the Contagious. Of course, as the figureheads of his great conquest, they were the soldiery most associated with unshackling Terra's population from tyrannical oppression. However, the butchery of innocents by the Legio, if more commonly witnessed by those freed populaces, may have been terrifying enough to stay some from donating their tithes or admiring their part in Terra's pacification. You see, the greatest flaw, and doubtless the main catalyst which led to the Thunder Warriors' extermination rather than relegation, was the unstable nature of Thunder Warriors' genetics. Whether Legio Primarch or neophyte recruit, the body or even mind was known to rebel against the unnatural genetic alterations made to these men. For instance, at any time, whether in the heat of battle or rested at camp, a Thunder Warrior's blood could rail against the arteries carrying it, bursting free from them and causing catastrophic hemorrhaging and so death. This is but the least of horrific ends these soldiers faced at any time, their tampered biology threatening to undo anyone at any moment in time. Even superhuman muscles were witnessed all of a sudden and without warning to inflate by horrendous proportions, drowning and also pulping Thunder Warriors in seemingly mutated heaps of flesh. Some would say these deaths were undeserved ends for the men who had sacrificed their lives, indeed their very humanity, to free Terra's population from the Gene Witch or barbarian warlord. And in a lot of ways, this can be considered true. However, these biological disruptions to otherwise well-crafted gene-enhanced troops were to prove not the only defects strewn within the Thunder Warrior biology. Learning their own bodies were capable of betraying them at any instant, visited upon them without warning, the mindset of the Legiones Contagious became infinitely more uncaring of risk, their own deaths already assured in a wholly ignominious display of weakness of the flesh. So almost to a man, the Thunder Warriors fought like savage devils from the darkest pits of hell. No quarter would be offered, all arrayed before their might would be put down ruthlessly in a display of gene-wrought superior strength. The men who had become Thunder Warriors bore one last fault. That is, their mental state would deteriorate over the years. Besides their partaking in vicious, certainly callous killing, some would become altogether unresponsive during their murdering, certainly to any official orders. Do you believe these reasons are sufficient to put down the Thunder Warriors' legions as a whole? Or do you think further alteration should have been attempted to perfect the current gene-enhanced warrior of that era? Perhaps extermination was too callous. Would an alternative campaign, death in glory, have been a more suitable ending to those who had given everything in the name of Terra's conquest and illumination? Let us know what you think, either in the comments or over on our Discord. An additional concern towards the Contagious, one shared by those of high office within the fledgling Imperium, assumedly Malcador the Sigillite, as well as Constantine Valdor, is that the influence and power accrued by the legions over their distinguished years of service risked the Thunder Warriors forming a de facto kingdom or territory upon Terra. I'm sure you can understand how gravely a threat such as this is taken, no matter how remote the chances of it occurring. All these shortcomings, from unrestrained butchery to a worryingly degrading genetic side effect, could potentially spell doom for the Contagious. However, when taking into account the personalities of the Contagious members, that is, ambitious, competitive soldiers, these more human traits may just have been the final causation for the punitive measures taken by the Emperor and his council. The true end of the Thunder Warriors would come when the triumvirate of Malcador the Sigillite, Captain General Constantine Valdor, and Amara Astarte met to discuss the role gene-enhanced warriors would play within the Imperium. They would discuss the potential of the Thunder Warriors as well as their drawbacks, but also possible replacements, which we later see in the Space Marine legions. What must be noted during these discussions is that Constantine Valdor does not agree with the heavy-handed approach that he claims Malcador the Sigillite proposes, assumedly the wholesale eradication of the Contagious. One thing we as the audience also must realise is that during these conversations of whether to maintain the current soldiery, Constantine Valdor was not aware of the horrors which awaited the Imperium's armies beyond Terra's orbit, though we can assume quite safely that Malcador did. Whether the Sigillite believed the weaknesses we just discussed justified their extermination, or he figured a fighting force more resembling the Astartes legions would be more suitable to the task of galactic conquest, Malcador's fervent backing of Gene Hand's soldiery has been noted before even the Emperor's bargains with the Gene Witches of Luna. So being made aware of both their greatest accomplishments but also their genetic flaws, ask yourself a question and please comment below, as I'm truly interested in your opinion. Do you believe the Space Marine legions were superior to their predecessors, or should the Thunder Warriors have been utilised instead to conquer the galaxy? I'll let you know my thoughts at the end of the video. And so it was that through the betrayal of their genetics, as well as the enjoyment they'd found in bloody slaughter, the fate of the Thunder Warriors was sealed. The official story, mere propaganda to disguise the fact that the Emperor's henchmen had chosen to eradicate an entire wing of mankind's military without tabling it for as much as discussion with any of the civilian political body, was that the Thunder Warriors died to a man in a confrontation against the last great barbarian force in opposition to Terra's unity. What you must know is that there are two distinct lies within this propaganda, and one uncertainty. One, it was not merely barbarians who sought the death of the Legiones Contagious that day. Secondly, not all the Thunder Warriors were eliminated. A few dozen escaped. And finally, it is quite possible that only Imperial forces were present on Mount Ararat that day. There is no evidence which points to the presence of an army not belonging to the Imperium being present on the battlefield of Mount Ararat. We learn this through High Lord Canderwire's excavation of the scene some years later, present within the novel Valdor, Birth of the Imperium. What we do know is that following the excavation of the site wherein the Thunder Warrior legions met their doom, steel, iron, auramite, and an unknown compound, possibly ceramite, was found. There is no mention of the remains of tech barbarian tribes, though this could always have been omitted from the novel and isn't necessarily evidence that only Imperial forces were present on Ararat that day. But how did 20 legions of superhuman warriors, each individually stronger and tougher than a Space Marine, meet their end in such secrecy? By the time of their eradication, the Emperor had for years chosen not to replace the casualties suffered by the legions, whether this attrition was suffered as a result of battle or death through genetic mishaps. Though the final numbers present on Mount Ararat may never be known, what is certain is that their numbers were greatly diminished. Of those who escaped the slaughter, 24 Thunder Warriors, led by Primarch Ushatan of the 4th Legiones Contagious, and accompanied by thousands of mortal troops, opposed to the dictatorship the Imperium was truly becoming, besieged the Imperial Palace whilst it was still under construction. We also know that the most famous Thunder Warrior to have ever lived, Arek Tyrannus, along with others of his kind, fled to the decrepit Petitioner's city, where Arek founded a criminal organisation, changing his name to Dekal. The life of Arek in hiding from Imperial retribution can be found within the Horus Heresy novel The Outcast Dead, which I again won't spoil for you now. Others made their way off-world, though many, if not all, were run to ground by agents of the Imperium, most commonly Custodian Guard, for what other warrior had even a chance at defeating one of these ancient giants in close quarters? And so were the Thunder Warriors phased out and replaced by the Astartes. Do you think that Space Marines are superior gene-enhanced soldiers compared to the Thunder Warriors? The psycho-indoctrination of Space Marines, paired with the fact they are inducted at far younger ages than the Thunder Warriors of old, are both advantages for the Astartes. Besides being robbed of their own individuality and therefore being less prone to ignore orders, they also tend not to experience biological issues with their implants post-induction into the actual fighting force. Perhaps the greatest advantage that Thunder Warriors hold over Astartes, though, is their sheer might. But also a more overlooked fact is that when exposed to the raw energies of chaos-fueled sorcery, they seem to repel this power back towards their adversary with a hate-fueled violence. Is this trait superior to Astartes, who we've obviously seen become corrupted by exposure to warp sorcery? Or do the Thunder Warriors' shortcomings still exceed these flaws in the Space Marines of the Great Crusade and onwards? Personally, I believe either one of two things. Firstly, and possibly more conversely, is that through the various works conducted under the Emperor's program by Amara Astarte and her compatriots, is that perhaps a more concerted effort should have been made to perfect the Thunder Warriors' genetic process. Of course, we know Astarte explored many possibilities for decades, possibly even over a century, in her works for the Emperor's Gene-Hands programs, so maybe this is something that was visited. In actuality, it would make sense if this option was the first explored. Secondly, I do believe that were the Thunder Warriors produced en masse in the way the Space Marine legions were, and then sent into the stars to conquer the galaxy, the slaughters conducted by the Night Lords and World Eaters during the Great Crusade would likely pale in comparison to the fear and despair hundreds of thousands of Contagious would sow. I do believe that replacing them with the Astartes program was justified, though of course, the way this was carried out, I don't believe is. The Thunder Warriors knew their time was limited, being crafted into what they were from adulthood rather than adolescence as Space Marines are. The average Thunder Warrior knew well what he sacrificed to become one of the Contagious and battle for unity. A more fitting end should have been sought out, something honourable at least. I really think you'll love this video if you enjoyed this one. If you're on a mobile device, you probably can't see the end screen video, so just check the description for the link. Don't forget we also have a Discord server where we chat about lore and the hobby, not to mention a Patreon where you receive new, high-res artwork for your own posters, wallpaper, or whatever you like. Both those links are below. We'll be voting on which artwork will be our first, so make sure to come on over to our community page on our YouTube channel. Don't miss our upcoming videos where we discuss the state of Terra prior to the Unification Wars, new lore regarding the Votan and Necrons at war, as well as a truly in-depth history of the High Lords of Terra, the evolution of their administration, and various scandals that plagued their office through the millennia. You know we cover all brand new lore as it's released, so make sure you subscribe so you're kept up to date with the ever-changing and evolving lore of 40k these days. Thank you so much for watching, take it easy, and have a good one.